Thank you. Now I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, Professor Stephen Macedo, who is the Laurance S. Rockefeller Professor of Politics and the University Center for Human Values at Princeton. He writes and teaches political theory, ethics, public policy, and law, especially topics related to liberalism, democracy, citizenship, diversity, civic education, religion and politics, family and sexuality. He's author of Just Married, Same-Sex Couples, Monogamy, and the Future of Marriage. That is his most recent book. In it, he defends same-sex marriages, marriage as a civil institution in law, and monogamy from the standpoints of justice and the human good. From 2001 to 2009, he was director of the University Center for Human Values, founding director of Princeton's program in law and public affairs. He chaired the Princeton project on universal jurisdiction and helped formulate the Princeton principles on universal jurisdiction and edited a book titled Universal Jurisdiction, International Courts, and the Prosecution of Serious Crimes under International Law. As a vice president of the American Political Science Association, he was the first chair of its standing committee on civic education and engagement. He is the principal co-author of Democracy at Risk: How Political Choices Undermine Citizens' Participation and What Can We Do About It. His other books include Diversity and Distrust, Civic Education in a Multicultural Democracy, and Liberal Virtues, Citizenship, Virtue, and Community in Liberal Constitutionalism. He is co-author and co-editor of American Constitutional Interpretation. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and vice president of the American Society for Political and Legal Philosophy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Macedo.
Well, thank you very much. It's awfully nice to be here. I appreciate that introduction. You didn't hear a lot about the Middle East in those remarks, and that's because I'm not an expert on the Middle East, I'm afraid to say. I think my sole qualification for being here is that I am an FOA, friend of Amani. hopefully that will be sufficient. I'm also a political theorist, as was said, and if you ask my colleagues, that means that they will tell you that you should lower your expectations. So in any case, I'm grateful to be here. It's nice to get out of my chaotic, unstable, faction-torn country and come to a wonderful, civilized city like Beirut. I want to talk about a tension within traditions of thinking about human rights and social justice, and relate this discussion to some of the issues that we or you will be discussing over the next 2 days. This tension concerns the nature of human rights and the global role of Western ideals of liberal democracy and social justice, and Western philosophical and moral ideals of individual freedom and equality. Now, one approach to thinking about human rights and global justice is sometimes called cosmopolitan, and also sometimes called a philosophical approach, where human rights are regarded as universal, but based on the abstract value of individual autonomy or agency, freely choosing and pursuing one's own favored conception of the good life as an individual, and having the freedom to criticize and revise one's commitments. Western philosophical accounts of human rights often highlight the universal value of individual agency or autonomy, and human rights are held to emanate from this core of value that inheres in the individual. So Martha Nussbaum, for example, has argued that, and I quote, "There are no obstacles to justifying the same norms in the area of basic entitlements for all the world's people." But human rights instruments and international commitments also express the idea of collective self-determination. Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights describes collective self-determination as the right of peoples to, and I quote, "freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development." Now, of course, there's once again a liberal and cosmopolitan way of expressing this value of collective self-determination by straightforwardly universalizing the core ideals of liberal democracy. We could insist on a human right to democracy, perhaps understood in terms of multi-party elections and one person, one vote. So here again, our domestic liberal democratic values become the basis for conceiving how the right to collective self-determination globally should be understood by extending these Western ideals of individual liberty, equality, and democracy. Now, defenders would say that these are philosophical ideals that happen to have been most elaborately theorized in the West, but they're not specifically Western ideas. And that's fair enough. Obviously, there are lots of overlapping and shared values across nations and cultures, lots of interests, and that's important. Nevertheless, I want to suggest a different way of approaching these issues, which I think will also be familiar to many or all of you. In current academic debates, this alternative approach is sometimes called political, as opposed to philosophical or moral. I accept the label political because it's less purely philosophical, for sure, but in fact it's not less moral, and actually it's also no less cosmopolitan, but it's both moral and cosmopolitan in a more complex way. And it represents the idea of human rights as political constructions reflecting shared values and a kind of global public reason. Now, this alternative approach gives more weight to the fact of global diversity among cultures, nations, or collectively self-governing peoples, and the value of toleration or respect for the diversity of local cultures consistent with a commitment to basic human rights and collective self-determination. I take this alternative route, as does my colleague Charles Beitz in his book, The Idea of Human Rights, and in this we both follow John Rawls, most important political philosopher since John Stuart Mill at least, in his short and rather cryptic book written towards the end of his life, The Law of Peoples. Joshua Cohen, for example, also follows this approach in an article called Minimalism About Human Rights. Is it the best we can do or the most we can hope for, or something like that. Now, Rawls is widely regarded in Anglo-America and much of Europe, not all, as the greatest philosophical champion of liberal democracy since John Stuart Mill, again at least, in my view. And so some consider it paradoxical that he did not simply universalize liberal democratic ideals formulated in his work, The Theory of Justice and elsewhere, as global standards to guide, say, foreign policy. Domestically, Rawls formulated his account of liberal democratic justice based on an original position in which we imagine ourselves as individuals behind a veil of ignorance. The idea is that we know the general characteristics of our society, but not our particular place in the society. The society he imagined is a pluralistic Western democracy with moderate scarcity and competent institutions. The principles that are chosen are familiar to Western pluralistic social democracies with a strong emphasis on a wide range of individual liberties, including freedoms of sexual expression and privacy, and egalitarian principles of fair distribution, specifically fair equality of opportunity and what he called the difference principle, which is the idea that inequalities are permissible only so long as they tend to improve the position of the worst off in society. Now, I think these are beautiful ideas of social justice, and I endorse them. They're the best principles yet designed in the context of modern, pluralistic Western democracies. But in fact, in many ways, they're even more specifically American. He has discussions of civil disobedience and affirmative action for racial minorities that remind one strongly that book that I referred to, Theory of Justice, was written during the 1960s and early 70s. And when we think about it, some of the views that he advances there reflect the American constitutional tradition, even in contrast with European traditions where established churches, say, are much more common and public funding of religious schools is much more common, which would be considered unconstitutional in the United States, for example. And so Rawls himself thought that we should not simply universalize these principles or this approach to thinking about social justice and basic rights. He insisted to the contrary that the whole approach of his theory of justice reflected the specific assumptions of modern Western pluralist democracies, and moreover that the device of the original position as formulated there was specifically designed for generating principles in this context. So it turned out there was a far more communitarian, if you want to put it that way, aspect underlying his theory, which had by many people been considered to be a kind of epitome of Western abstract individualism and universalism. But it turns out there's a far more particularistic aspect to his thinking, which I think is quite important. To universalize, he argued in his later book, Law of Peoples, and also in Political Liberalism, that to universalize a procedure developed in the domestic context for specific purposes of generating principles of justice in a particular place begs the question of what principles should apply across societies, and it's presumptuous to assume that we can universalize conclusions reached in our own particular context of principles of justice formulated from a particular domestic perspective. So he rejected what we could call the simplistic cosmopolitanism that extrapolates from abstract philosophical ideas formulated in the West and adopted a more complex stance that sees the problem of generating principles to guide the interrelations of states or peoples globally as distinctive, and calling for its own distinctive procedure, one that would be more respectful of global diversity, or at least try to be more respectful of global diversity. And I think Charles Beitz's account of human rights as a practice builds on this approach and gives, indeed, Rawls's approach greater subtlety and detail. Now, I should hasten to add that the conclusions yielded by this alternative political approach are not necessarily radically different from those generated by arguments that begin with more abstract philosophical principles, because, of course, those principles have to grapple eventually with the diversity of circumstances and claims. And this more political diversity respecting approach is not necessarily a basis for a more minimal account of human rights. The point is to generate a more justifiable and appropriate respectful procedure or way of thinking about the issues, and not to prejudge the substantive questions one way or the other of what standards should apply in the relations of states as they hold one another accountable for the way they govern domestically. So Rawls imagines a global original position made up of representatives of liberal democracies and what he calls decent peoples, not knowing the size of their states or their geographical situation, and they choose principles to regulate their relations as peoples, not as individuals, from the standpoint of this very different global original position. And the global principles are quite different from those that are arrived at domestically. And a crucial aspect of this global original position is that decent but not fully liberal and democratic peoples ought to be treated as equally and fully legitimate members of the Society of Nations. Now, the details of this treatment can be left aside. We have no time for it, and you may have no interest in it. And I think we can say that the crucial issue is this. When we think about our relation with other political societies globally, a crucial question is when we should regard a government as fully legitimate representative of its own people. And that is not the same question as whether it is fully liberal and democratic by our lights or whether it's fully just by our lights. The question rather is when a foreign government legitimately represents the shared values and common good of its own people. So if this is right, what are the appropriate standards of regime legitimacy that should guide the foreign policy of liberal democratic states and decent political societies? For Rawls, as for Beitz and Cohen, the basic requirements are twofold. Rawls puts it in terms of respect for basic human rights and representative institutions such that everyone's good is adequately taken account of in lawmaking, so that the law of the political community genuinely reflects everyone's good. These are threshold standards. If sufficiently satisfied, a government should be respected by other states as fully legitimate. Now, let me say just a little bit more about this. With respect to the human rights component, both Rawls and Beitz say that what's crucial from the standpoint of global relations among states is respect for human rights proper, the subset of truly basic rights in the Universal Declaration, but not all of the rights in the Universal Declaration, not including, for example, vacations with pay. These may be very important, but they're not part of the core function of human rights, which is to protect the most urgent individual interests against the predictable dangers to which they're vulnerable in the typical circumstances of modern states. Human rights violations are matters of international concern, and their serious violation is held to justify action on the part of the international community, including interference in a state's internal affairs to see that these rights are protected. We don't want the list or the grounds for justified interference by states in the affairs of other states to be too expansive because of the dangers of abuse. Feitz and Rawls also converge on a second requirement of global legitimacy, the value of collective self-determination, which they offer as an alternative to the idea of a human right to democracy. Rawls puts this rather cryptically in terms of, as I said before, the idea of decent but not fully liberal and democratic peoples. These political communities may not provide political representation on the basis of full equality. They may favor a particular religious view by having an established religion and provide some offices that are only open to those who are knowledgeable in the official faith. But they provide sufficiently for free expression and the representation of all interests in society, such that the law of the society can be honestly said to represent the good of all, including the good of minority groups. The normative idea here is not, again, a fully liberal democratic ideal of constitutional democracy, perhaps constituted, as we're familiar with it in the West, at least in theory, of one person, one vote, and full political equality. Those are at least the ideals, not the realities. But rather the idea of government as a matter of genuine collective self-determination based on the shared values of the political community, consistent with human rights proper. This requires sufficient rights of free expression, free association, the right to protest, the duty of public officials to respond to complaints and protests on the merits. And Rawls emphasizes that in such regimes, the rule of law is very important, as we'll be hearing about later today, and an independent judiciary to help ensure that common good principles really are taken seriously by public officials. And again, rights of protest and free expression really are protected by the judiciary, and also so that public officials are accountable for abuses of power. And only where these rights are secured can we say that the community is genuinely politically self-governing according to its own collective values, perhaps not on a liberal democratic basis, but on its own genuinely shared common basis. Now, this position has a familiar ring, obviously. I'm not saying anything at all new here. I mean, decades ago now, Lee Kuan Yew argued for a distinctive set of Asian values. Asian societies, he said, give more weight to communal and familial obligations than do the individualistic societies of the West, and they give a higher priority to economic and social rights, he claimed, than to freedom of expression. He said it's unreasonable to expect East Asian societies like Singapore, as he was arguing back then, to adhere to the same sets of fundamental rights as Western societies like the United States. Now, the obvious problem with such arguments, especially when they're advanced by a political leader like Lee Kuan Yew, is that it's all too convenient for an authoritarian to claim to speak for the culture of his people. As Jack Donnelly put it, if the differences between East and West are truly as claimed, Asians can be trusted to exercise internationally recognized human rights in responsible ways that make the proper allowances for their cultural values. As he concluded, Asian autocrats, it seems, think much less of the inclinations and capabilities of their peoples. So we need to thread a needle here and do the best we can to reconcile two convictions. First, that respect for the diversity of cultures and traditions means that we cannot simply universalize the liberal conception of justice worked out within Western societies. But second, that we must not bow to cultural diversity as a way of rationalizing authoritarianism and repression. Okay, this has all been very abstract, but the core idea here is this. To the extent that some critics of the West argue for the legitimacy and respectability of distinctive forms of collective self-determination based on local traditions and cultures, and perhaps religious beliefs that are widely shared within their societies, we can say fair enough. But the idea of collective self-determination itself carries its own critical resources and requirements, which we should expect such countries to live up to. It requires respect for basic human rights and sufficient political rights, political representation of all interests, and sufficiently inclusive and responsive governance so that the government of the society really represents the shared values of the society rather than the whims and preferences of political leaders. We cannot understand any government to be the agent of a collectively self-governing people if it systematically violates human rights or if it represses political expression. Moreover, in terms of what might be called performance legitimacy, we cannot regard a society as legitimate if one privileged class or segment in society reaps all or a grossly disproportionate share of the benefits of social cooperation, as in the case of so many countries today. And we say this not because we're foisting Western individualist ideals on other countries, but rather because the distinctive normative claims that rulers themselves are typically relying upon in these circumstances, when they claim to be the authentic and legitimate representatives of their people, call out for respect for these standards that we would associate with collective self-government. And these standards reflect global human rights practice, to a great extent, as Beitz argues. Now, let me suggest a couple of applications here, since this has all been very abstract. And first I'll talk about, why not a human right to democracy? Rawls argues against a human right to democracy, as I suggested, and puts it rather cryptically, holding out the possibility of political communities that are oriented around a religious conception or a common good conception that respects basic human rights, that allows for political freedoms of dissent, that protects minority interests, but in which public officials really justify themselves in terms of a common good conception. He imagines an idealized Islamic republic, which he calls Kazakhstan. It's Islamic, but a genuine republic. There are special privileges for the established religion, but robust protections for minorities. Josh Cohen endorses this general idea, and I have as well. Now, Beitz offers a more specificity for why we should prefer the idea of a human right to collective self-determination rather than democracy. One reason is that the case for democracy is partly and importantly instrumental. That it delivers development and prosperity for its citizens and distributes those benefits widely rather than narrowly to the favored few. But in practice, Beitz argues, adoption of the democratic form of government, at least if it's understood in a straightforward way as perhaps requiring something like one person, one vote, may not reliably deliver these goods. In very poor countries, he argues, the evidence is mixed for the proposition that democracy conduces to development. The evidence is at least uncertain. So he favors the more abstract and somewhat more open-ended idea of a human right to collective self-determination rather than democracy, as it's liable to be institutionalized or it's liable to be insisted upon in the human rights context. Now, how might this idea work to impose critical standards when local resistance to the idea of self-determination on the part of leaders is self-serving rather than public-spirited? Consider a recent critique of democracy in defense of meritocracy offered by Daniel A. Bell in his provocative book, The China Model. He argues that China's one-party state, informed by Confucian values, emphasizes public-spiritedness and Chinese traditions of advancement in office based on examination results and performance reviews. And he argues that this furnishes an alternative, legitimate, and possibly superior model of governance to democracy, at least for China, with its specifically Confucian traditions of meritocracy and public-spiritedness, he claims. Now, what would the idea of collective self-determination have to say about this? Well, for one thing, as Bell himself argues, China has a long way to go with respect to basic human rights protections, freedom of expression, and the rule of law. And he's argued that he thinks China may be moving in these directions of greater human rights protection, and that some of Xi Jinping's increasing repressiveness is a consequence of his anti-corruption campaign. Well, let's leave that aside. At least the need for greater protections for basic human rights seems to be common ground. And he argues that China, like many other societies, is not doing a good job of spreading widely the benefits of economic growth. But what about political representation and the relationship between elites and the governed? Here is where his argument becomes strange. The enabling condition of governance based on merit, according to Bell, is that China's one-party rulers are not accountable in mass elections. He thinks that pandering to the electorate makes it impossible for democratic leaders to favor the long-term interests of society. The leaders of the Communist Party, on the other hand, know that they and their organizational successors will still be in power decades from now, at least if the one-party model holds. And this, says Bell, allows them to favor the long-term interests of their society, to plan for the long-term interests of their society, and so on. And yet, all of the measures of accountability that he favors, the examinations, the performance reviews, and so on, are themselves all overseen by agencies of the Communist Party itself. So why should we think that, in this case, absolute power doesn't corrupt? Elites already in China frequently favor their own family members. So what's missing in Bell's account is an adequate account. If it's not going to be accountability in mass elections on the basis of one person, one vote, then some other accountability mechanisms to make sure that leaders serve the interests of their people. While Bell makes the most positive case possible for the benefits of one-party authoritarianism, well, he also offers a crude and simplistic model of constitutional democracy as one person, one vote, ignoring elaborate constitutional mechanisms that are crucial to democracy in the West, including separation of powers, judicial review, a career civil service, and delegated authority to expert bodies, such as regulatory agencies and the Federal Reserve Board, all of which embody the meritocratic values in the context of Western constitutionalism that he favors, but are at least indirectly accountable to the public. So what's missing in his account are adequate accountability measures. If not one person, one vote, fine, but some kind of adequate accountability mechanisms to make sure that his all-powerful political leaders, the all-powerful political leaders in China will be accountable to the people. Now, no doubt China will make its own way forward and hopefully move towards a more legitimate model of governance on its own terms, reflecting in part its distinctive values and traditions. Human rights standards do not require China to adopt a model of one person, one vote, or any other specifically Western liberal democratic institutional model, but it is altogether proper to insist with human rights advocates in China on greater respect for human rights, greater freedom of expression, association, protest, press freedoms, and a genuinely independent judiciary, and some plausible and plausibly effective measures to hold leaders accountable. So we can say at the end that the government is genuinely the agent of its people and not their overlord or their organizational emperor, as one scholar of Chinese institutions puts it. Finally, a couple of points in concluding and perhaps moving a little closer to the region. Some of the papers describe, for this conference, the ones I've been able to look at, describe various forms of political activism and agency that continue to take place in the face of renewed authoritarianism in Egypt and elsewhere, and the meaning and impact of these activities, these protests that are taking place, sometimes behind the scenes, their meaning and their impact are empirical issues, as is the question of what, if anything, outsiders can do to help. Now, as my brief discussion of the right to democracy, or the lack of human right to democracy, as presented by Bytes suggests, on the political view of human rights standards that I've defended, many important questions concerning both the content of human rights and the more instrumental question of how to achieve them and stably institutionalize them are importantly empirical questions. They're not just abstract philosophical questions. The reason being that the aim of the practice of human rights is to secure the underlying human interests that human rights protect. And that requires institution building, the building of stable institutions. And that implicates, obviously, a whole range of empirical questions, which we will be exploring to some degree over the next couple of days. And it's also important that institutions and practices to promote human rights and legitimate collective self-government have to tap into and build upon local practices and understandings and social networks. Outsiders can't just come in with pre-designed blueprints and menus and seek to impose them domestically. I realize this sounds rather platitudinous, but if we want to make effective and long-lasting change, it requires building on local traditions, local understandings, and working with local actors. Now, as I say, I'm not an expert in this area, but one of my favorite examples involved the collaboration of the political theorist Jerry Mackey and the educational NGO in Senegal, Tostan, which operated with support from UNICEF. Together they've worked, and there's articles that I've read, to curtail the practice of female genital cutting by tapping into local community networks and the very ties of family and ethnicity that perpetuated these practices in order to shift social norms around the practice. And this required local social knowledge and understanding of what kinds of networks and local leaders and so on might be engaged in order to shift the social norms around these practices, and it's worked quite effectively. I have a copy of a New York Times article that's quite interesting from a few years ago. So insofar as Western NGOs wish to engage on these issues, it's very important to tack into local practices and to seek to understand and work with local groups in order to develop their own social norms in the direction of greater respect for human rights and collective self-government. Finally, several of the papers speak to the failures of neoliberal models of economic governance and transnational institutions like the IMF and the World Bank that have sustained them. And here we have a joint challenge: how to make the economic engine of globalization work for all. In the U.S., in the recent election, we saw a backlash against established parties led by you-know-who, the current President of the United States. Partly moved by the anger of those who were left behind by economic growth. I mean, to put the most positive spin on it, in globalization. Some of this has happened in Europe as well. If you look at statistics in the United States on the job gains since 1990. If I'd had time, I would have prepared a PowerPoint. But if you look at job gains since 1990, distributed by ethnic group, per share of the workforce, it's been substantial job gains for Hispanics and blacks and others, but among white, especially low-educated whites, job gains have declined. So the fact is that in the United States, as elsewhere, the institutions that have fostered phenomenal economic growth, which has been hugely important from any human rights standpoint, more people rising out of dire poverty in the last 25 years than certainly any era in human history, a phenomenal, vast gain in human well-being. But the distributive consequences in the United States and Western societies and elsewhere has not been altogether defensible. And the consequences can be terrible, as we've seen with the election of someone who has played on these anxieties in a terrible way in the United States. And it remains to be seen what's happened in Europe. So we all need to think more about the distribution of the gains of globalization and economic development. We certainly benefit, us here, academics who get to travel to lovely and exotic places like this, cosmopolitan types, but many don't. And in the United States, the backlash of, as a colleague of mine at dinner last night said, the losers has been terrible in this election, and we'll have to wait and see what the consequences are. So managing this processes of economic growth, processes of globalization, so the benefits flow to all, is certainly an additional challenge for us in the United States and for people here in the region, I'm sure, as well. So I think I'm going to conclude with that, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Macedo, for this very stimulating lecture. And I think that much of what you've said is indeed relevant to the discussion we're going to have here on our region. I'm referring more particularly to this tension between adhering to universal norms and insisting on national self-determination, cultural specificity. This debate has gone on in this region for decades, and I think it's now being renewed, though expressed in different ways in different society, with the failure, as it were, of the so-called transition to democracy. People are raising the kinds of questions that you have not only alluded to, but articulated in a more general theoretical manner. So I claim this is absolutely relevant to our discussion here, and I would like those of you who are interested in sort of bridging what has been said by Professor Macedo with the preoccupations of this conference to speak, but I'm not limiting your freedom to ask him questions or react to what you've heard.
Feel free to make statements.
Absolutely. تفضل. Microphone.
My name is Mustafa Kamil Said, and I also teach political theory and human rights at Cairo University and at the American University of Cairo. And I enjoyed very much your talk because it touches on many of the issues I discuss also in my courses. My first question relates to your theoretical framework. You are building your theoretical framework on the arguments of John Rawls. And John Rawls has been criticized by many people, but one of the people who criticized John Rawls is Amartya Sen. He published a book and he tried to offer a concept of justice inspired more by cultures of non-Western countries, India, China, etc. And he proposes entitlement to be the basis of a different concept of justice. And he also criticizes this notion of the original position. He disputes the fact that if we are given the freedom to choose what sort of order, some people might like an inegalitarian order. So I would like you to address, first of all, critique to John Rawls. Secondly, my guess, you try to deal with this issue, the tension between human rights and collective right to self-determination. You dealt with it at the global level. You refer to China, Singapore, etc. But I think it is also important at the domestic level. And I think this is a question of multiculturalism. So we have seen multiculturalism. We have seen in Europe the rise of right-wing parties who deny the right of Muslims to build minarets, to be dressed the way they like. So I do not see in what you said a way to resolve this problem when the majority of people opt for a certain culture which denies the basic rights of other people who are living within the same country. Thank you very much.
Yes. Can we just, it'll get very confusing, I think, if we have very different questions on the table. I'll be brief. I'm not going to really address the first question because I'm not a big fan of that Amartya Sen book. I don't think he conceives Rawls very well. I'm a big fan of Amartya Sen, but not that book. But I think the latter question is really interesting and important. There's a book I would recommend, not because I agree with it, but because it's extremely provocative. David Miller's Strangers Among Us, I think, or Strangers in Our Midst, which is a recent book about mass migration to Europe and the refugee issue, came out in 2016. He has long been known as a liberal nationalist. This book is almost liberal nativism, not quite, but he courageously, I think, addresses very, very many of these questions about cultural accommodation of migrants and including Muslims in Europe in ways that are very provocative and interesting, though not ultimately entirely satisfying. I mean, he allows, and I would insist that if a country is going to admit people, those people have to be treated, and certainly again in the context of as fully equal members of the society. And so the shared culture. I mean, there are two options: either the shared culture expands to include these newcomers, and it means that requires adjusting the shared culture. It doesn't, it's not a matter of assimilating, the newcomers to the way we do things. Rather, it needs to be integration, which is a two-way street. So I think in the United States, that's been the model. There's been a strong insistence on a shared culture, but it's a culture that's been capable of absorbing is the word that's often used, but absorbing immigrants in a way that it changes as well. The character of the United States has changed itself collectively with increasing numbers of Hispanic people and so on. But with the idea of a shared public and shared institutions and kind of abstract ideals, which I think is the American way. In the European societies, I'm speaking very crudely here now, there's often a sort of thicker sense of shared culture and less of an immigrant tradition. So there have been some real issues. I mean, the alternative is to allow people parallel institutions in some measure. In European societies, the fact is that in France, while with its traditions of secularism and strong separation of church and state, they do provide funding for both Catholic and some Jewish schools. So if you're going to do that, you have to be fair at some level. So either people need to be included in common institutions which expand to include them, or if you're supporting particular groups, particular religious institutions and so on, that has to expand as well. So, I mean, these things are taking place. They're extremely sort of difficult issues. I don't have a good model. It's one of the interesting things about this Rawlsian view that I've described is he is assuming a simple case where you have a country with a shared community. It's kind of like Michael Walzer stuff in a way, assume a shared culture. Where societies have divided cultures, divided, like even Canada, but other kinds of cases, then there needs to be some sort of fair division. But the basic model is some sort of fairness, even in terms of common institutions or separate institutions that are nevertheless treated somewhat proportionately. I think the American model has been very effective in a number of ways. Where we have had a kind of strict separation of church and state is a misnomer because there's always an interrelation. But essentially with respect to schooling, for example, the strong principle has been that we fund public schools and we don't fund religious schools. We allow people to send their children to religious schools, they have religious freedom, but we don't fund them. We also don't regulate them all that much. But that's worked reasonably well to have a robust public sphere and to allow people the freedom to have their own separate institutions, but not so much funded. In the European state, with a stronger emphasis on pillarization and state management, I think the model is yielding some additional tensions that are difficult to deal with. Anyway, that's a kind of abstract issue, but I look forward to talking more.
Thank you, Professor Haidar.
For the talk, and my question is a bit theoretical as well, and I see the old Platonic tension or problem with democracy and this tendency to go to populism. Now we see it translated in places. I see that tension, that view of that we are scared of fragility of democracy at some level. On the other hand, there is this fear about abuse of power. Abuse of power, and this is why we need accountability. So I see that tension clearly, and it's an old tension. And of course, modern democracies try to deal with that by creating kind of elitist democracy where you have parties that run the show most of the time, and so it distances people from the theater as much as possible and desirable. So referendums gives us bad taste because they bring people to the theater, and sometimes direct votes to presidents, as in the US now. But this seems to be an old tension and, that exists. I don't see the tension between self-determination and democracy.
You might be right.
Because if there is a claim of a tension, that the people determine themselves through their political values through the democratic process. The problem is that it seems that we don't want self-determination because we are afraid that self-determination might result in the wrong values, populist, nationalist, racist. So it's not a tension between democracy and self-determination, it's somewhere else. I don't see that kind of tension being expressed unless we assume that the values of the people are better expressed through the rulers rather than by the people themselves. Once they vote, they misrepresent their own values, and that's a kind of a stretched claim. So I don't see how you defend that tension between democracy and self-determination.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And democracy, of course, is a very general, abstract, and rather vague concept, in that it can be manifested in a number of different institutional forms. I mean, the general idea, though, is democracy is collective self-government on the basis of the political equality of all citizens. And so what Rawls argues, and some of these others, is that you can have a system of genuine collective self-determination that might not be strictly on the basis of political equality of all. So again, in his idealized Islamic Republic, there might be some clerics that have some special powers, perhaps with regard to the courts, whatever, but generally robust republican institutions around them. And he allows that, with respect to, there's some literature on transitions to democracy in Africa, that perhaps women, might not have full political equality in all areas of life, but so long as they're sufficiently empowered so that they are the ones locally who are able to negotiate their way forward, that should be sufficient for outsiders. So the departure from democracy is the departure from the insistence on political equality of all citizens. But you're right, it can't be so large a departure that people that they lose their agency. That they're not participating in their collective self. So I agree with you. It's a kind of abstract distinction. And after all, some people want to say that constitutional democracies are not full democracies because they allocate power to unelected Supreme Courts and so on. I think that's false. But part of the issue here is that democracy itself is rather contested terrain. And the simplistic conceptions of democracy, at least, are what are being departed from. The idea of identifying democracy with mass elections and one person, one vote, that particular institutional moment. But we know, as I think you're suggesting, that democracy is more complex than that. I think they want to, maybe they're recording or something.
Okay, so I'm not a political theorist, but I'm a political scientist, and I wonder if my question is coming from what I think are the implications and the ramifications of the Arab Spring. So you and Rawls clearly excluded governments that violate political rights. So there was an emphasis on political rights, that governments that systematically repress or that deny freedom of expression are not legitimate. But I think, and I would argue, and it might be controversial, that what we saw in the post-Arab Spring was that that's not where a lot of people are placing the legitimacy of regimes. They're placing them in the socioeconomic sphere, and part of the let's say in Egypt the electoral failure of the pro-revolution forces was that most people didn't care about these political rights, and they were more concerned about security, economic security, but also mainly economic rights, and even in their polls, or they would say, they would even think or conceptualize of democracy in terms of economic rights. And then add to that the backlash and the repression that comes after this kind of uprising has led a lot of people, and I've heard this from a lot of Syrians especially, to really question whether political protests should be a right. Like, was it worth it? And that brings us even to a juristical sort of old tradition in Muslim jurisprudence, which says you cannot come out against the ruler because the result is so much bloodshed and tumultuous circumstances that it harms everyone. So my question is that if under the veil of ignorance we know that we're an authoritarian regime and people choose then to say, okay, we don't care about political rights. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
No, it's a very good question, and I won't comment at length because it's a very good question. I mean, there are transitional issues as well. I mean, one of the defenses of certain kinds of limitations of liberty in a place like China, and one of the arguments against moving towards, I mean, that one hears, at least, and certainly one heard more a couple of decades ago, is the diversity of the country, the low literacy rates, and so on, are the preconditions of even collective self-governance met. And there will be transitional issues, that are different in different places and that require perhaps something less than full realization of even some of these other ideals. The question then will be, are you moving in, I guess, the right direction? But the question that you're talking about, where conflicts may be such or traditions may be such that certain kinds of open political protest have a different meaning, perhaps, or different consequences than we would otherwise expect. I think all of those things are relevant. I mean, I think you're quite right. One of the things I think about this sort of a political approach rather than this purely abstract philosophical approach is that, and I think this is true of rights domestically too, we often think that rights have to be protected and formulated because they tend to lead to good consequences. They represent forms of respect for people, but their institutionalization tends to secure certain interests in a stable and predictable way. So if circumstances are such that that's not to be expected, then it would require some sort of revision, I think. It's a fair enough point.
There it is, yes.
Thank you. Zainab Hanna, I teach political science at AUB, and I'm a coordinator at Amal Association, an NGO based in Lebanon. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I think you raised many controversies about human rights that are really key. And we know that human rights took a weight after 1948, the Universal Declaration, knowing that human rights started with the French Revolution in 1789, that by then, and there are many political...
Americans would say they started a bit earlier. Sorry.
Yeah, Hammurabi and other, but definitely there are reasons why human rights took so much weight in the international arena, and there are some political, and we know peacekeeping missions, humanitarian interventions were never objective towards the countries of intervention. We know human rights are indivisible, interdependent, but the achievement of political, civil, and cultural rights were always easier on states than economic and social rights, and definitely because this requires more resources, etc. And whenever we're speaking about social justice, we refer to economic and social welfare. And this is key for the people. And this is where the question marks comes back to humanity. Are we respecting the humanity of the people? Democracy, since the decades where we're speaking about is democracy an effective state or not, and now we're seeing the wave of the implications of democracy, where you spoke about the value of having institutions, and where in practice we're moving more now, instead of a rule of the people, toward moving to the rule of the elite, and moving away from socialism and from serving the people. So the main question is, we're not seeing the people as much as they're getting educated. How much are they able to hold the government accountable? To what degree are they able and capable to be politically mobilized to come together and ask for their rights? So still human rights are being on a theoretical level, but in practice they're not being easy to be implemented by states. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, there are aspirational dimensions to, especially the social and rights to social justice and so on, for sure. So I think I'll accept that. Now, I don't want to encroach on the time for the next panel. So is it 10:15 we're supposed to end, or?
Yeah.
We can carry on informally later on.
Yeah. Maybe we could carry on informally. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you
For your inspiring lecture. Leila, you have announcements to make?
One more announcement. If you are a speaker, at the end of the day, the bus that will be taking you back to the hotel is from the Penrose gate. So that's the gate that's that way when you exit the building. Just ask us and we can let you know. Also, I forgot to thank Rami Khouri, who started and initiated this project and helped us, me and Sarah, and we learned so much from Rami, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Rami.
And that's it. Thank you.
So we move to second session, isn't it? Or we have a short break? But very short break.
It's over. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.